Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're just thrilled to welcome you back to the Seminars in Society and Neuroscience, which is organized by the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program at Columbia University. The series brings together interdisciplinary perspectives on mind, brain, and behavior research. All our fall public programming is virtual, which means that people across the world are joining us. For today's seminar, we just have a thrilling, stellar group of speakers who will discuss the role of mind wandering. Happens a lot. If this is your first seminar in society and neuroscience, I want to just very quickly tell you about a little bit about the program and the Center for Science and Society. The Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience facilitates cross-disciplinary collaborative research to advance our understanding of mind, brain, and behavior. It brings together talented early career scholars from various fields, together with faculty experts in neuroscience and in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. The core of our program is our early career postdoctoral scholars who pursue independent research at the intersection of neuroscience and the arts, humanities, and the social sciences. Each scholar receives tailored support for their project from at least 2, and often many more, faculty members from different departments who have the relevant knowledge and expertise to help guide their research. Current mentors come from neuroscience, sociology, psychology, psychiatry, medical humanities, and ethics, music, and philosophy, as well as English and comparative literature, and actually many other disciplines. The scholars and PSSN faculty are central in organizing interdisciplinary events. Our next virtual seminar is here on the screen on October 18th, 4 p.m., Music, Identity, and Social Bonding, Moving Beyond the Lab, which will examine how music can build shared identities and mental states and bring us together. I really urge you not to miss it. We're delighted to announce that the recruitment of new presidential scholars for 3-year positions will resume again this fall. We have 2 positions. Postdoctoral positions available in this cycle, and consistent with our 2022 version, priority will be given to applications that align with the goal of supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion within the program. You can find more information on our website. Please also visit our website to register for upcoming events and sign up for our newsletter. And you can also connect with us there on Twitter, Facebook, and everything else. For tonight's event, please participate in the discussion at any time using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote questions that you see in the Q&A that you want to hear answered, and we will wait until after the end of the event or at the end of the event to answer questions. The PSSN program would not be possible without the support of leadership at Columbia, our valued steering committee members, and faculty from across the university who participate in the advisory committee, mentor our scholars, and volunteer to review and interview applicants. Thank you to all of you who have helped to make this program a real example of interdisciplinary achievement. We will be providing ways to keep in touch in the chat box with all of you throughout the event. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Presidential Scholar Valerio Amoretti. Dr. Amoretti is a literary scholar who studies how reading and writing affect our mind and brain. Dr. Amoretti draws from contemporary object relations psychoanalysis to understand the role that literature and narrative play in enabling long-term psychic change and creativity. As a presidential scholar, he explores the neural basis for these processes. Dr. Amoretti received his PhD in 2019 from Columbia University's Department of English and Comparative Literature, with his dissertation focusing on the psychic work involved in reading modernist fiction. Welcome, Valerio.
Thank you, Pamela. I hope you can all hear me okay. Good afternoon to everybody. If you're on the East Coast, at least, good afternoon. I'd like to begin by not only thanking Professor Smith, but also acknowledging the help I received from Professor Chris Peacock, Dr. Melinda Miller, and Joseph Sulik, and others at the Center for Science and Society who have helped to conceive, organize, and promote this event. I want to say a couple of words about the event, but I'll keep this extremely brief since we have a great set of presentations that we want to get to. And I'm not going to attempt a general definition of mind wandering now. I presume that each of you in the audience already knows at some level what mind wandering is, that you have an internal concept of what it feels like when your attention becomes loose and your ideas and memories and facts and sensations all seem to take turns on the center stage and to live one moment in the limelight of your mind. Perhaps you've used one of a series of near synonymous names for mind wandering, like daydreaming, reverie, spontaneous thinking. Each of these terms adds a different shade of meaning. And depending on your disciplinary background, you may be more or less invested in using a particular one. At different times, you may find mind wandering enjoyable or an unwelcome distraction, but I trust that if you're in the audience, you presumably agree that it is a fascinating and puzzling phenomenon. My own background, as you've heard, is primarily in literature. Mind wandering lives many lives in literature. Reading accounts of writers' creative processes, for example, I was always struck by how central states of reverie and daydreaming seem to be for many writers. It is almost a cliche to hear writers say that they don't know what they're going to write until they write it, and that letting the imagination run loose and letting the mind wander is part of how the writing happens. Mind wandering is also frequently represented in literature. My favorite literary period, which is modernism, novelists developed a technique which is often referred to as a stream of consciousness. Those are actually words from William James, or interior monologue, to actually reproduce on paper the natural wanderings of the mind of their characters. Think of the novels of Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, for an example. And there are some wonderful pages where Joyce follows closely the thoughts of his character Leopold Bloom as they hop from one thing to the next, mixing his immediate and practical concern with more far-fetched fantasies and some typically wacky theories that Bloom has. My favorite is his conjecture that if he could constantly travel west faster than the sun, he would never get a day older. So through this technique, whoever reads Joyce's Ulysses ends up feeling like they know Leopold Bloom very intimately, and often he lives then with them for life. So in this sense, you may say that he truly never gets a day older. Several other examples of mind wandering in literature could be listed, both from different corners of the Western literary tradition, other arts and cultures altogether. But underpinning many of these cultural lives of mind wandering are some key ideas, assumptions even, that I think are going to be part of our discussion today. So I'm going to mention two just briefly in broad terms. One is that the contents of our daydreams and our nighttime dreams, for that matter, are in some sense meaningful, perhaps even in ways that the individual in question is relatively unaware of or fully unaware of. And this is, after all, why we teach students of Joyce to pick apart the wanderings of Leopold Bloom's mind. And two, that the process of mind wandering is in itself evidence of some kind of mechanism, some form of mental or psychic work that is going on. And this is perhaps why creative writers feel that this is how their work happens. So with these ideas, for a start, with this hypothesis in mind, we turn to today's event, which is going to be a familiar interdisciplinary dialogue between neuroscience and psychoanalysis, with a caveat that I'll get to in a minute. We turn to neuroscience not only because an understanding of the neural basis of phenomena like mind wandering should be part and parcel of an interest in matters of the mind, even for those of us who come from the humanities, I argue. But specifically because, as we'll hear, the neuroscience of mind wandering and spontaneous thought has made incredible strides in recent times. And we return to psychoanalysis as the discipline that, perhaps more than any other, has emphasized the usefulness and significance of dreams, free associations, and daydreams to a systematic study of the mind. But psychoanalysis, I should point out, and this is the caveat, has evolved much from its Freudian beginnings. And today we get to hear about a theory and technique that is based on a deep revision, if not a revolution, of several of Freud's initial hypotheses. And while classical Freudian theory has been the subject of an established dialogue with neuroscience for a number of years now, the same cannot quite be said of some of the contemporary versions of psychoanalytic theory, like the one that we'll hear about today. So hopefully we're going to discover some common ground. So I will introduce each of the speakers before they talk, and we will then have a panel discussion, and we'll get to a Q&A from the audience. So please, as Pamela mentioned, go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A box. First speaker is Professor Kalina Christoff. Dr. Christoff is Professor of Psychology at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, where she was also until recently the director of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Dr. Christoff's research employs both functional neuroimaging techniques and behavioral testing to study human thought broadly. Over more than 2 decades, Dr. Christoff has published dozens of articles in peer-reviewed journals and has edited the Oxford Handbook of Spontaneous Thought, which came out in 2018. She has written extensively on mind-wandering, creativity, meditation, and more recently, psychedelics. And she's a leading expert in the cognitive neuroscience of mind-wandering. So with this, I leave the floor to Dr. Christoff whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Valerio, for organizing and envisioning this event and for having me here take part in it. And thank you for this very in-depth and incredibly up-to-date introduction of me. I don't think I could have done it better, especially when it comes to the most recent notings of what's been going on in my life. So thank you for this. And what I'd like to do, first of all, is share some slides with you so that I can take you over a few tidbits from my fields. And when I say fields, I use the plural because I straddle the fields of psychology and neuroscience. And what I will try to do today is give you a snapshot of how we have been relating to this phenomenon of mind wandering, though sometimes it could be referred to as reverie or free association. In fact, we have so many ways to refer to it that I believe it's one of the symptoms of a very rudimentary understanding and a need to understand it a lot more so that we know how exactly to refer to it and what we're referring to. So I titled my presentation, Mind Wandering, a Force for Fill in the Blank, because I wanted to tell you about how psychologists and to some extent neuroscientists have been filling in that blank. And it strikes me that when Valerio introduced the subject, he used this beautiful phrase, the psychic force, or I'm not sure he used the word force per se, but this is the drift and the idea. And that is in fact how I think about mind wandering based on my, at this point, some decades of researching it and trying to understand why do we do it so much. We do it a lot. Anything between a third and more than a half of our waking lives we spend in something that could be termed mind wandering or by a number of other terms. But why do we do it so much? And what does it give us? So this has been my beginning point. What is it that force for? When I first started studying this subject, I was struggling, and I still am, with what are the best ways to refer to it. And it really started, my interest started very early on when I was a child in, why is my mind never at rest? Why do I always think about something? And I always wanted to understand that. So the first time I had a chance to look at that from a scientific perspective was in graduate school, when I had a very unexpected data set, which I collected almost by accident, and in which I compared what happens in people's brains when they rest versus when they do an incredibly simple, in fact, mind-numbingly simple task, which just in this case involved people pressing a right button when they see a right pointing arrow and a left for a left arrow. So what we saw was the brain ablaze, and in a somewhat systematic fashion. And this finding we observed around the time when Michael Rako had published something similar, although with slightly differently distributed regions, and something that he later termed the default mode network. So at the time, I was thinking of what I was seeing in the brain going on during this rest as most likely a spontaneous thought type of process, somehow identifying for myself the spontaneity of it as a characteristic feature. A few years later, after this particular data set was published, a really influential paper was published in the literature in a journal called Psychological Bulletin by two of my colleagues at the time. Both Jonathan Smallwood and Jonathan Schler were at UBC, and so was I. And in fact, Jonathan Schler was my next door neighbor, and we ended up talking about this phenomenon and what is it and what should we call it. And Jonathan Schler and Jonathan Smallwood at the time picked the term that has stuck with everyone. In fact, they picked it very deliberately, this term, mind wandering. They specifically mentioned in their paper why they wanted to use it. They said, by referring to this phenomenon as mind wandering, a term familiar to the layperson, we hope to elevate the status of this research into mainstream psychological thinking. So they were bringing in a lay term into scientific discourse in order to be able to have people relate to it more easily. That's part of it, and to just popularize it, and to, I think in some ways, help the research field and the research in it take off. And take off it did, because if you look at the number of mentions of the term mind wandering in a journal article's title or abstract, it was only one in 2006, that particular paper. But 10 years later, in 2016, it was exceeding 100 of paper, and it's just gone up since then. So it was a successful introduction, although I have had countless discussions with them as to the wisdom of introducing this folk term in a very specific manner that doesn't necessarily scientifically, the scientific definition of it, don't necessarily match the fullness of the folk intuition about what mind wandering is. And I'll get into that a bit later. But before I get into that, I wanted to mention that a few years later, together with Jonathan Schler and Smallwood, I was doing neuroimaging next door to them. And so we thought, well, why don't we put people in the scanner and see what actually happens in their brains when they are mind wandering? So what we did was put people in the scanner, but more importantly, how do we know that they are mind wandering? No one had actually asked people to what they were doing and then look at the brain based on what they said they were doing. So what we did ask them was, where was your thought, where was your attention focused just before the probe? And there was an option for them to tell us, was it on task or was it off task? And this ended up being one of the relatively popular papers that specifically defined mind wandering in the way that relates to the task. So were you on task or were you off task during your thoughts? And so what we saw was, first of all, something quite surprising. Not only was the default network really activated when people were going off task relative to when they were going on task, but also what at the time we referred to as the executive system of the brain was equally activated to the default network. So it seemed like this executive mode was coexisting with this mind-wandering mode during these off-task episodes. But one thing I'll share with you that at a personal level, which I never shared with my colleagues at the time, I was deeply dissatisfied with the way we operationally defined mind-wandering in this case, because basically we defined it as task-unrelated thought. And some part of me kept asking, is that all there is to mind-wandering? And I had this emotional dissatisfaction with the limited nature of definition that provided. Just the year after that paper was published, the most highly cited paper in the field of mind wandering was published, titled "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." And that made a huge splash. It came out in Science, and the title claim of the paper, which was then reinstated into the introduction of the paper itself, surprised me, because I personally don't feel, for the most part, that when I mind wander, I'm unhappy. At the time, this particular year, I happened to be giving birth to my first child. So I didn't have a lot of time to look into the data and ask for supplementary materials and so forth. But a few years later, with some of my students at the time, we were able to look into this more carefully and then look at whether that claim had been consistent with the other literature. And what we found was that the claim itself was not consistent with either the subsequent attempts at replication or indeed with the empirical finding of the paper itself, because the claim is that a wandering mind is an unhappy mind, but the data itself in that paper, and you see here an attempt at a meta-analysis or a review of the literature of these findings relating emotion to off-taskness. The finding itself was that people were, if you ask people from a 0 of being unhappy to 100 of being super happy, they were 58 from 0 to 100 on that scale. So 58 where 50 is like a blah of neutral affect. So the consistent finding of the literature, and indeed that original empirical finding, had been that people are just not particularly happy, but they're not unhappy either. They're just kind of in this neutral zone on the average. Of course, there's huge difference within an individual and across individuals as to how people feel about their mind wandering on a moment-to-moment basis. But the average seemed to be actually pretty neutral, and if anything, on the positive side of neutral. And that's been something consistent. So when you see that claim, take it with a grain of salt, as I do these days, because there's been this consistent mismatch between that claim and the empirical reality of what we see in the literature. In fact, we're in possession of a manuscript, which unfortunately was not accepted for publication because it seemed to be the wisdom that, of course, mind wandering is unhappy. So how could it not be? And so in some sense, we weren't able to publish that at a peer-reviewed journal, partly because there seemed to be a lot of reviewers who just rejected outright the notion that there's a mismatch between the empirical findings and the conceptual claim. So what we did with a number of my colleagues is try to rethink that concept of mind wandering and what it is. And we proposed that what it is indeed is, in fact, not a task-unrelated thought per se, but a mind-wandering, spontaneous thought. And so we introduced a dynamic framework of thought, as we called it, which tried to explain this phenomenon, this mysterious phenomenon, in terms of the kinds of ways in which thought may become constrained and no longer free or no longer spontaneous. And when those are weak, we postulated that there will be spontaneous thought occurring. So we introduced these two types of constraints that seem to be at play in the mind. And one of them we call deliberate constraints. This is the force of the will. So the ways in which we constrain our thoughts deliberately, whereas the other kind of constraint that could apply to our free associations is more of an automatic constraint. So those are emotional influences or outside world influences, things that we're not intending to constrain our thoughts, but in some ways do. And as an example of that, you'll see you get on the two extremes of automatic and deliberate constraints. When they become really strong, you get very different mental phenomenon. So when deliberate constraints are very strong, and by the way, when both types of constraints are weak, you see forms of spontaneous thought, which include mind wandering, but also include nighttime dreaming, as well as creative thinking in some sense. Now, when the deliberate constraints are quite strong, we observe, or that is how we see the conceptual space of thought. We start experiencing and engaging in what we call goal-directed thought. So this is very strongly directed thought with some purpose in it. intentional. Whereas when the automatic constraints are really strong, what we could see are, in fact, especially when there's a negative phenomenon, there's negative content to thought, we can see things like rumination and obsessive thought, which for the most part are not under our deliberate control, but sometimes they could be, as not as a prototypical case, but as a prototypical case, they are in fact really good examples of a very highly constrained, automatically constrained types of thought. And one of the ways in which we engaged this particular framework was to link it to how it might relate to that phenomenon of free association that, that Valerio talked about, and also mentioned the book that we edited. And one of the chapters in this book specifically dealt with this notion of why does the mind tend to churn out these variable and freely associative contents all the time? Why doesn't it just give it a rest? You know, whether we're sleeping, whether we're just resting and closing our eyes. In fact, we've looked at meditators who have been meditating for decades under some monastery conditions and very dedicated meditation techniques. Every 10 seconds on the average, but oftentimes more often, they would report a new thought arising. So it seems to be that psychic force that drives the mind into a movement, and it never lets it grind to a halt. So what we proposed, based on the neuroscience of mediotemporal lobe mechanisms, is that in fact that variability of thought that gets produced, and it's not just produced content, that content seems to be almost, it seems to be purposefully variable over time. So we propose that that default variability in mental content that oftentimes free association can generate and produce a drift in our thought is in fact an adaptive mechanism, because when you look at some of the mechanisms of pattern separation and pattern completion, the different subportions of the hippocampus are involved in, it almost seems to be this beautiful interplane between pattern separation and completion, in the sense that we complete new thoughts based on cues, but then there's some very different thought coming up next, almost like to differentiate the thought from the first one, and then it's cued again by another one. And one thing that can be related to is, in fact, what we know is an efficient way of learning things, which is to have sparse type of learning. And it seems to be creating an environment of sparse learning of an encoding of our own experiences that benefits both our semantic knowledge and our episodic memory efficiency. This is also linked to some of the findings that we have seen, in which in those experienced meditators whose brains we scanned, the hippocampus and the parahippocampus on both sides is activated seconds prior to them reporting the arising of a spontaneous thought. And that seems to be quite unique, and it almost seems to be an indication of something arising seconds, and this was always continues to surprise me, that we can see that before the meditators themselves can detect the arising of these thoughts. This is also consistent with some single cell record findings that were published about 10 years ago, in which case free recall, which is as close to free association as you can experimentally induce with a task, memory task, was associated with activation in hippocampal and entorhinal cortex cells, so mediotemporal lobe activation, again, seconds prior to the arising of these free recall memories, in this case of movies, I think they were being shown. So one of the things we've tried to do most recently, and this is work that we're doing in collaboration with Robin Hart-Harris, who has become known for his work in psychedelics, is to bring together the fields of creativity and what we understand about creativity, as well as psychedelics, and put them in that conceptual space of thought. And the only thing I will say about creativity, because I'm sure I'm running out of time, is that creativity is a lot more complex than what I showed you in the first version of this and what we published in the first version of this dynamic framework of thought. Because in the first version, I just put it in a box in the center of this space. But in fact, creativity and creative thinking is a highly dynamic process that in fact navigates in that space in certain cyclical and dynamic ways, so that we combine some highly spontaneous thought with subsequently some highly constrained thought, and it's the dynamic interplay between these two within this contrast that creativity arises. So the next time you're sitting on the bus or on the train, and you might want to consider this question that I put to you at the beginning: mind wandering is a force for fill in the blank. Is it a force for good? In which case we should probably sometimes put down our iPhones and all of our to-do lists and just let it happen. Or is the force for bad, as some people seem to believe and see in their results very strongly? In which case you're probably better off engaging in anything but it, and in which case the iPhone is a brilliant invention. So before I pass on to Larry Brown, I wanted to just acknowledge all the brilliant people that helped me do that research and inspired me to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. So I will very quickly introduce the second speaker, who is Dr. Lawrence Brown. Dr. Brown is a clinical psychologist and an adult and child psychoanalyst trained at the Boston Psychoanalytic Society Institute, where he is currently a faculty member and supervising analyst. He's also, I believe, a faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis and a founding member of the Boston Group for Psychoanalytic Studies. Dr. Brown has published dozens of essays and papers over the years. He has also co-edited 2 books. In 2013, Growth and Turbulence in the Container Contained, Beyond's Continuing Legacy, and in 2016, on Freud's formulation on the 2 principles of mental functioning. But he's also the author of 2 books, monographs. The first one is very dear to me, called Intersubjective Processes and the Unconscious, an integration of Freudian, Kleinian, and Bionian perspectives. It came out in 2011, and more recently, Transformational Processes in Clinical Psychoanalysis, Dreaming, Emotions, and the Present Moment. All these are out on Karnak. Dr. Brown, over to you.
Thank you so much, Valerio. I really appreciate it. And I was thoroughly interested in this meeting from when you first invited me to join in. And so it's exciting to be a part of this, and thank you. I'm going to read my paper here, which is entitled Mind Wandering, Free Association, and Reverie, a Psychoanalytic Perspective. And I begin with a short quote from Wilfred Bion, who says, "There is something curious about the analytic intercourse. Between the 2 of them, they give birth to a new idea." So I am honored to join this discussion about mind wandering, which has long been an interest of mine, but known by other terms in the psychoanalytic world, free association, and the more contemporary concept of reverie. Prior to speaking with Dr. Amoretti, I never heard of the term mind wandering. And upon Googling it, I was surprised that most of the meanings listed had to do with pathology. For example, the Harvard researchers Killingsworth and Gilbert that Dr. Christoff mentioned state, quote, "A human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind, because people spend 46.9% of their waking hours thinking about something other than what they're doing, and this mind wandering typically makes them unhappy." From a contemporary psychoanalytic perspective, one's wandering mind may be an invaluable partner in analytic practice. Indeed, our training emphasizes that we keep an open mind to any and all thoughts and subjective experiences which occur to us in a manner described by the poet John Keats as negative capability, in which we are, quote, capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. To be sure, we are all susceptible to our Walter Mitty moments of seemingly fanciful distraction. However, the psychoanalyst asks himself or herself why this specific thought is occurring at this particular moment with this certain patient. In this regard, mind wandering is an essential tool for today's psychoanalyst. At the heart of the psychoanalytic endeavor is an emotional experience born of this analytic intercourse, which is unconsciously constructed from psychic elements in the patient and the analyst. Initially, this shared emotional state is devoid of signification, and through a process akin to dreaming, the patient and analyst each give representation to the ambient emotions that suffuse the analytic field. This complex activity remains unconscious, though there are certain moments when the analyst notices a momentary thought, perhaps a line from a song or a poem, a mind wandering that meanders unbidden into his mind. In classical psychoanalysis, the clinician was warned to ignore these supposed distractions. But nowadays, we attach great value to what we call reveries. In what follows, I offer a vignette to demonstrate the formation of a reverie from the interlinked free associations of a patient and myself. Ethan, a young man in his 20s, has begun for the first time an ever-deepening romantic relationship with Rachel. He often struggled with the wish to end their courtship, especially at junctures which led to further intimacy. She, too, had her own set of anxieties, but the couple persevered and were on the path to a genuinely loving connection. Ethan began one session, as he often did, by relating some incident with his girlfriend that stirred his uncertainty about their growing involvement. Perhaps it was time to back away, as he had done in previous relationships. Yet our work together revealed his significant anxieties, and we attempted to sort out some sense of the actual Rachel from his perceptions of her. Now, a familiar theme that felt a bit repetitive to us. I noticed that I had slipped into a visual reverie of various danger signs one might see on a descending mountain road with hairpin turns. And so I said to Ethan, excuse me, I think it feels like your relationship with Rachel is going down a road with many signs warning you of danger, and that you and Rachel are not heeding those signs. Signs like sharp curves ahead, steep descent, and peligro. I was surprised that the word peligro, which is Spanish for danger, spontaneously appeared in what I was saying to him. At this point, a smile suddenly beamed across his face, and he sat forward in his chair. I can't believe what you just said. It reminded me of a dream from the other night that's so much like a metaphor that you just used, almost identical. That's weird. And he told me his dream. Rachel and I were driving in sort of a road repair truck. She was driving, and we had to stop every few feet to put down these cones to tell people to drive carefully. As we moved along down the road, we came to an end of it, and there was a sign with a big X across it to indicate the end of the road. But Rachel kept driving, and we ended up in a very shallow puddle that was getting deeper as more water was flowing in. Suddenly, there was a huge wave that covered everything, and that was the dream. It was really scary, he said. He said that the idea of a road repair truck felt heartening to him, that despite his anxiety about the deepening intimacy, he and Rachel were having honest conversations. It seemed to me that his focus on the reparative aspect of the dream, the road repair truck, while certainly relevant, also moved away from the frightening emotions of the dream, at which point I became aware of unconsciously using the word peligro in my interpretation to Ethan. Now, I don't speak Spanish, but I've traveled to South America on many occasions, and I wondered why the word peligro came to mind at that moment in my reverie. This question immediately brought to mind the Yungas Road, Y-U-N-G-A-S, in Bolivia, which is also known as the Road of Death, and reputed to be the most dangerous in the world, which descends 12,000 feet from the cool highlands to the Amazonian rainforest. I once fantasized driving that road while planning a vacation in Bolivia a few years ago, but came to my senses when my wife confronted me with how nutty that was. I felt anxiety in the session as this memory came to me, and importantly, my association to death and catastrophe signaled that both Ethan and I were sharing feelings of a deadly plunge. He submerged in a huge wave that covered everything, and I plummeting down from the road of death. Realizing the magnitude of fear that my reverie and its association strongly suggested, I interpreted to him, quote, "The road repair truck surely is a comforting image, but your dream goes on, crosses a forbidden barrier, and then a huge wave covering everything. You're very frightened in the dream," I say. Ethan responded with silence and looked worried, then said he was thinking of women he had hurt in the past and was now worried that he could hurt Rachel even more than the other times because of their deeper intimacy made them both more vulnerable. Ethan's anxiety about hurting women brought to mind that I had seen him in psychotherapy for about 2 years when he was 6 years old because of intense anxieties and anger that centered around feelings of loss. His father had a struggle with cancer. And in addition, a neighbor woman was also struggling with cancer. As a result of the neighbor's illness, Ethan, an only child, had to share his mother with the woman's son. In his play, when he was 6 years old, the sessions consisted of whipping Barbie dolls while gleefully laughing and holding his genitals. At that point, now being an adult, I reminded him of this history, which we had spoken about previously, that helped to deepen both his and my experience of Ethan's anxieties in the present and what brought him to see me years earlier. A brief discussion now. A close-up examination of this session offers a more nuanced view of the often subtle, nearly imperceptible interactions occurring in this hour. Ethan began the hour speaking of his growing involvement with Rachel and the anxiety that evoked in him. An insightful man, he was able to appreciate that the actual Rachel was likely very different from his perceptions of her, which was an important realization that allowed him to get more deeply involved emotionally with his girlfriend. In the session, excuse me, I suddenly became aware of a visual reverie that appeared unbidden of danger signs that one sees on descending mountain roads. I have come to regard such reveries as the byproduct of communicative projective identification that also is, as Bion has commented, a thought looking for a thinker. What was Ethan asking me to think or feel for him that was too dangerous for him to think on his own? My inclusion of the Spanish word peligro among the danger signs also came to mind unbidden, surprised me as I said it. Interestingly, Ethan responded immediately to my interpretation based on my reverie and with a broad smile, and found it weird that the metaphor I used, the road signs indicating danger, reminded him of his dream. It is always fascinating, even uncanny, that the analyst and the patient end up nearly thinking the same thoughts, and it strikes me that our mutual associations were a pathway to conjointly representing danger associated with getting more deeply involved. In my opinion, this is the essence of what we call the psychoanalytic process. Two psyches giving birth to an idea. Put another way, my reverie and Ethan's dream were both products of an intersubjective analytic field created from features of his anxieties and those of mine emerging in the session. The more unconscious levels of the danger associated with getting in too deeply were revealed in Ethan's dream of the shallow puddle that was suddenly flooded by a huge wave. And the Spanish word peligro came to my mind at that point. Of all the possible words and metaphors that could represent danger, I wondered why this particular word emerged in my reverie, and the youngest road associated with plunging to one's death immediately came to mind. I think this representation is a perfect example of unconscious work, choosing, as it were, the most appropriate word to capture the emotions suffusing the unconscious field, crafted from Ethan's and my shared experience at that moment. As I have described in other writings, this shared unconscious intersubjective field is an emotional experience arising from the intersection of aspects of the analyst's and the patient's internal world. This shared unconscious emotional experience is a condensation of analogous elements in the analysand and the clinician that represent the operative emotion of the moment that has formed instantaneously in the session, like a painter choosing various colors to create a particular mood. Thus, an unconscious sense of danger and fears of taking the plunge dominated the session, which Ethan and I both dreamed or gave representation to through our respective associations, by which aspects of the patient and the analyst have instantaneously cohered around an emotional core to represent those affects in the immediacy of the therapy session. Taken from another perspective, my reverie and its association with the Jungus Road served an important interpretive function. It stood for the anxiety of taking the plunge, yet also gave expression to the terror associated with that step. When I emphasized the degree of Ethan's intense anxiety about deepening the relationship with Rachel, he began to speak about his worries of having injured women in the past. Ethan's association of his current anxiety with having injured women in the past triggered my recollection of his early history and my previous treatment of him as a young boy. thereby giving him a more complete understanding of his struggles in the present and their connection to his early anxieties in childhood. I should add that while writing this paper, my mind meandered. I recalled a memory from my early childhood of being on my father's shoulders at the top of the Statue of Liberty, and a strong, dizzying feeling of plummeting to the ground below. In retrospect, this terror at the Statue of Liberty must have been a substrate of my conscious fear in the session of plunging off the youngest road. Last few sentences here. Neuroscientists postulate a default mode network, which is sort of a cruise control for the brain and thought to be involved during mind wandering. As I understand it, the default mode network is engaged when the brain is at wakeful rest, and experiences such as mind wandering and daydreaming are common in this state. It seems likely to me that this state of mind is similar, if not identical, to what psychoanalysts call dreaming while awake, in which the analyst abandons memory and desire in order to be maximally receptive to thoughts that effortlessly meander into one's mind, what we call reveries. These are not goal-directed deliberations, like planning one's dinner, but rather the absence of intentionality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll just very quickly introduce our last speaker, who is Professor Joseph LeDoux. Not that he needs much of an introduction, but anyway, Dr. LeDoux is a university professor and Henry and Lucius Moses Professor of Science, Professors of Neuroscience and Psychology at NYU, Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the NYU Langone School of Medicine, and the Director of the Emotional Brain Institute. Since 1974, he has published hundreds of articles in peer-reviewed journals and has won numerous awards from scientific, psychological, and philosophical societies for his work. Many of us in the humanities, of course, have encountered Dr. LeDoux's work in the form of his highly acclaimed and often cited books for general audiences, including The Emotional Brain, The Mysterious Underpinnings of Emotional Life, which came out in 1998, and The Synaptic Self, How Our Brains Become Who We Are, which came out in 2003. More recently, Dr. LeDoux published a book called Anxious, Using the Brain to Understand and Treat Fear and Anxiety. And the last one is The Deep History of Ourself, the 4 billion year history of how we got our conscious brain. I believe this came out just last year. Dr. LeDoux is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences, and the frontman of a band called the Amygdaloids. Dr. LeDoux, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Valerio. Thank you. Am I here now? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Valerio. As I started to say, muted. If you know anything about my work, you may wonder what I'm doing here. And I asked the organizers at the beginning why they invited me, because I didn't think I was probably the best person to do this kind of thing. But they convinced me to participate, at least as a discussant. And so what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about my perspective on things and try in some way to put all this together, or at least find some threads that puts me together with the other two speakers. So let's see how I do. I'm going to share the screen now. Okay. I found this cool slide for looked like a good thing for mind wandering. So before the meeting, the two other speakers submitted papers that would be representative of what they spoke. So Kalina started with a quote from William James in her paper. She said, he said, as we take a general view of the wonderful stream of our consciousness, what strikes us first is this different pace of its parts. Like a bird's life, it seems to be made of an alternation of flights and perchings. The resting places can be held before the mind for an indefinite time. So obviously we need to understand consciousness if we want to get to the heart of mind wandering. And in Larry's paper, he says this, and you've just heard him say it, at the heart of the psychoanalytic endeavor is an emotional experience born of the analytic intercourse, which is unconsciously constructed from psychic elements in the patient and the analyst. So I think what that means is to understand mind wandering, maybe we also need to understand how non-conscious processes interact with consciousness. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about here. So my perspective on all this is something like this. It's not, you'll find many things familiar to you. Right now, okay. So we divide the mind into non-conscious and conscious processes. Stimulus processing starts with the stimulus, goes through sensory processing in the brain, and that eventually gets to cognitive processing. Cognitive processing needs memory in order to make sense of the sensory processing and control behavior. So we need to add that in. And then out of this cognitive processing, at the last, the last microsecond before something is conscious, it's unconscious or non-conscious or pre-conscious. So from this cognitive processing comes some kind of conscious experience. Now, I have subjective report, verbal report down there, which is often talked about as if it were a direct output of consciousness. It's this conscious state that you use subjective report to map consciousness, right? Well, I think it's a different thing. I think that we have an output of non-conscious cognitive processing that is the basis of the subjective report. So let's look at that. So here we have the cognitive processing. The output of that, I think, is this non-conscious narrative that underlies both the content of the conscious experience and the content of the verbal report. But because they involve different downstream outputs, in other words, you need something beyond cognitive processing and the narrative to get to consciousness, and you need something beyond that to get to the verbal report. The two can sometimes diverge a bit. So you don't always have the ability to talk perfectly about what you are consciously experiencing. So why did I think this way? Well, be careful what happens to you in graduate school, because sometimes it can stick with you your whole life. And that's what happened here as a result of this experiment Mike Casanaga and I did as part of my PhD research in the mid-1970s. We had a split brain patient who's looking at two pictures, and the right side of the screen is a chicken claw going to the left hemisphere. So the right hand points to the chicken. The left visual field is a snow scene going to the right hemisphere, so the right hand points to a shovel. So we said, why did you do that? We're talking to the left hemisphere because the right hemisphere can't talk. So the left hemisphere said, I saw a chicken claw, and so I picked the chicken and need a shovel to clean up the chicken shed as a country boy. So without any pre-meditation or anything, this narrative just came out that explained this guy's behavior. And so we're chatting about it, and that night over drinks, and the idea came up that, well, maybe we humans use unconscious narrations to create these kind of conscious sense of mental unity in the face of the fact that the brain is full of a bunch of diverse systems that we don't necessarily have conscious access to. So one of the systems that might produce these unconscious behaviors we thought might be emotion systems. So I turned to studies of rats to kind of pursue these non-conscious controlled emotional behaviors and physiological responses in rats. And the research led me and the other people involved in this work in the field, which started out very small, was pretty large now, to a lot of deep understanding of the circuitry involved in so-called fear conditioning, which I prefer to call threat conditioning. and how it controls all these responses. And the amygdala turned out to be the centerpiece of the system. I didn't go looking for the amygdala, the circuitry took me there. So this is a kind of more conceptual model of what's going on in the presence of a physical or social threat, where it goes into a sensory system through memory. The memories that we have then enter these cognitive circuits. For example, schema allow us to conceptualize, given the situation, exactly what we're going to think about it. And that contributes to a mental model, but it's not just from episodic and semantic memory. The threat detection system, the amygdala, is providing body signals, behavioral and physiological responses that are feeding back. But the amygdalas are already also communicating with some of the brain areas that underlie these schema and mental modeling. And then the idea is that the narration is a non-conscious or pre-conscious output of this mental model that underlies the experience and the report. So my view of emotion, and it's been like this quite a long time, since even before I did any research on fear conditioning, but from those split brain studies, it's a narrative-driven subjective experience in a biologically or psychologically significant situation. So what's going on? Well, we've got too much. Got too much animation. I don't know what is happening. Okay. Let me get out of the presentation and see if you can see this slide. If we just do it like that. Okay, can you see that? Somebody shake their head. Yeah, okay. So the idea is that, we have working memory where we can monitor, appraise, attend to things, have metacognitions about, introspect, and give verbal reports. So it's sort of part of this whole mental modeling and schema integration and so forth. So what do we do with all this with? Well, of course, we have sensory processing that's going in there, semantic memories, episodic memories, self-schema, collections of information you know about yourself and how you act in certain situations, emotion schema, everything you know about emotion. So if the stimulus out there is a threat, you begin to have a schema that is moving in the direction of fear. And if your heart is beating at the same time, that kind of adds to the beating fast. If it's beating fast, that adds to the direction of fear that it's moving in. So we have body feedback, and brain arousal is activated by the survival circuit, the amygdala as well. And well, let's just leave it at that. Okay, so let me go back to the screen share. I am sharing. Let me go back to, my full PowerPoint. Okay, so one conclusion from all of this is fear is not universal. It's danger that's universal. So all humans have to deal with danger, and all cultures have words for danger and words for experiences that occur when in danger. But experience varies across cultures, and because we can translate words like fear across cultures, we sometimes assume people worldwide have the exact same basic experiences that are named by the word. But cultural differences are based on differences in the schema involved, and schema are also personal. So the different people within a culture have different schema and different experiences. So basically, my fear is not your fear. And the fear in one country is not necessarily the other fear, because we shaded this through various kinds, interpreted this through various kinds of personal experiences that are within the cultural schema. So animals lacking our kind of cognition can't have our kind of schema and our kind of fear, though their brains may well have some other kind of subjective experience in the presence of significant stimuli like this. So how does all this relate to Kalina's presentation? Let's look at this. So I'm a proponent of the higher order theory. I'm not going to defend this. I'm just going to describe it to you. There are other theories of consciousness. David Rosenthal is the godfather, guru of the higher order theory. He's down at the Graduate Center. So here's the basic idea. Stimulus goes to sensory cortex, but it's not conscious until it's re-represented in higher order cognitive circuits that allow it to become conscious. All right, so that's just the basic idea. And the lateral prefrontal cortex areas are thought to be are proposed to be kind of the mechanisms that underlie this kind of higher order re-representation. my problem with this is that I think it's a good starting point, but it's incomplete because one thing, it lacks memory. And as I proposed earlier, or just pointed out earlier, we need memory to make sense of all these things that we happen to conceptualize what's going on in the first order states. So what I think we have to do is add semantic and episodic memory, which are, the lower order sensory systems are interconnected with memory systems. In fact, it's sometimes said now that there aren't different perceptual and memory systems, but perceptual memory systems. So here we have semantic and episodic memory. These are going to get to the higher order prefrontal areas by way of intermediate order prefrontal areas, and including the representation of schema. And this will be by way of insular cortex and various medial prefrontal areas like ventromedial, orbitofrontal, anterior cingulate, and some others. We can think of these as sometimes, I think, that I sometimes do as anoetic fringe consciousness or stream of consciousness circuits, in a sense. They're not what's giving us the explicit conscious experience, the higher order experience, but they alone may be sufficient to give you this kind of streamish feeling. But so what does the higher order prefrontal areas do, like the lateral PFC, dorsolateral ventrolateral, and the frontal pole, anterior frontal cortex? Well, these would be what Endel Talving called autonoetic and noetic consciousness. In other words, autonoetic is consciousness based on episodic experiences. Noetic is based on semantic conceptual experiences. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, one thing that let's look at these three lateral prefrontal cortical areas. They're getting inputs from all these other prefrontal areas, insular and all the medial prefrontal areas, but also getting sensory inputs directly and all kinds of posterior parietal and superior temporal and medial temporal lobe inputs. So they are like a conceptual hub where they can get all of the information and put it together into the kind of pre-conscious state that will become a conscious state. At least that's how I like to think about it. So in relation to Kalina, some of the mind wandering, as far as I understand the processes, which is not in great detail, but as I understand it, it involves some of these so-called brain networks or cortical networks, such as the default network in particular, but also others probably. So how does it relate to Larry's presentation? So, mainstream neuroscience and psychoanalysis are not great buddies. There are some exceptions like Eric Kandel and Mark Solms, but for very different reasons, which I won't go into. Neuroscience gets along much better with pharmaceutical therapy and cognitive therapy, primarily because these downplay the subjective experience of the patient. Now, I've been arguing for a long time we need to put the mental back into mental disorders, otherwise we'll never really figure out how to treat them. Now, a colleague, when I published this idea with Danny Pine, a psychiatrist, a colleague who also works on rats and threat and fear and so forth, wrote a paper with the title that said something like, "We were sending psychiatry back to the dark ages." Clearly, that was a reference to psychoanalysis in this guy's mind. Again, emphasizing this kind of suspicion that neuroscientists have about psychoanalysis and all the wishy-washy, flaky stuff it's supposed to be about. So, which I don't believe, obviously. So here we go back to, we have a threat system, goes into a sensory system. Somehow I missed a slide that showed you the difference between a fear circuit and a defensive survival circuit, which is there is no difference. What I've done is relabel what the amygdala does, because I don't think of the amygdala as a fear center. I think of it as a circuit that detects threats and produces behavioral and physiological responses. The fear itself is something different. And what I think it is it's the cognitive interpretation of a situation. Now, the reason that drugs developed in animals in dangerous tasks don't work when they're given to humans is because, in my opinion, is because these drugs are basically tapping into the defensive survival circuit. The assumption is, well, if a rat is less timid and after receiving the drug, it must be less fearful or anxious. Otherwise, why would the drug work? And so humans should feel less fearful or anxious. But it doesn't really work that well in most of the cases. That the psychopharmaceutical industry has actually started withdrawing funds from research on fear and anxiety related drugs because they just can't get anything new beyond what they discovered in the 1960s, really, that moves the ball down the field. Many of those drugs in the 60s were discovered accidentally. So, in a sense, if the reason that we are fearful and anxious is not because of a defensive survival circuit, but because of a cognitive interpretation of the situation in which we find ourselves, which includes information from the defensive survival circuit, but the survival circuit doesn't determine it, it just sort of modulates it. It's kind of like you go into a restaurant and the music's too loud. You ask the waiter to turn down the music, and the music goes down. It's still the same annoying song that you don't like, but it's at least it's less annoying or less intrusive. So I want to now continue with what this means in terms of Lowry's presentation. So he said, and you probably heard him say it a little while ago, unconscious narration brings danger signs to the mind unbidden. So how does that relate to what I'm talking about? Well, so if the danger signs are unbidden here in the cognitive unconscious of the schema of the mental model, they would come to mind unbidden through this narration to the conscious mind. So that's, I think, how we can put Lowry into this thing here. But he also said two psyches giving birth to an idea. What does that mean? Well, I think these unconscious cognitive processes, I'm not really, I don't have a lot of experience with psychotherapy, but I've always sort of thought that maybe what's going on is that the unconscious mind of the patient and of the therapist is where the work is getting done. And I think that's kind of in the mental model here, the scheme in the mental model. It's kind of been creating a way to think about what's going on, and that through the narration can then be brought into conscious experience. So I think I'm going to stop rather than going into this long-winded thing here, but it's just a way, I'll just say it briefly. Think of three systems in the brain, like the amygdala, but I mean a lot of other brain areas as well. Step one might be to tame the amygdala, to target these behavioral and physiological symptoms. One way you might do that is subliminal exposure therapy or distraction. So a brain that's avoidant and hyper-aroused is not really ready for cognitive, mindful, or analytic approaches. But if you get rid of some of that stuff or kind of tame it in a sense, things might move forward more productively. Step two, tame the hippocampus, again, metaphorically. Target negative semantic and episodic memories and schema that bias thoughts and action, often unconsciously. But again, it might help to first get rid of that amygdala stuff that's getting in the way of doing step two. And finally, step three, tame the prefrontal cortex, again, metaphorically, so that you then talk through perspectives on who the person believes himself or herself or itself to be, and their problems are, and what their problems are, and what they want in life. But if you start with step three, and you got all this semantic and episodic baggage that's going to get in the way, and all this behavioral and physiological baggage that's going to get in the way, it might not be ideal. So, there's not a lot novel in this, but maybe small things matter. So many therapists do something like this, but often not at once. So the sequence may be important. And also another important point, I think, is that the knowledge of this logic is as important to the patient as it is to the therapist. To understand what the processes are in the brain might help us come up with a way to treat the whole person as an individual, recognizing its unique problems that can be separately targeted. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you were persuaded to participate and do this. In the end, it turned out it turned out very well. So I see that we only have a short time, and I want to make sure that at least one or two questions from the audience get to be asked. But I just wanted to really quickly ask something of my own, which is to sort of return to exactly where we started, which was the question of content, or what I think of in terms of content. I mean, you've all seen from Larry's talk how central the idea that what the content of those reveries may be needs to be not random, not mistaken, needs to be somewhat on target for capturing something. And if I heard what Dr. LeDoux said here at the end, this kind of wealth of input possibilities into these pre-conscious networks means that perhaps we can think of the stream of consciousness that populates mind wandering as something where there is some sort of opportunity for content that is meaningful in the way that psychoanalysis conceives, especially when we think of psychoanalysis in this more modern iteration, and not necessarily on a psychoanalysis that's predicated on the idea of repressed thoughts and so on. So I wanted to hear from both Kalina and Professor LeDoux what your thoughts were with regard to sort of the significance of contents of mind wandering, whether you think we can ascribe quite as much significance to that as we tend to do in culture generally and in psychoanalysis. And the other thing that I'm going to bring up just quickly, and then I'll sort of let you discuss freely, is also something that was highlighted from Dr. Brand's talk, which I thought was very interesting, the intersubjective aspect, the two psyches coming together. Now, Dr. Christoff perhaps can weigh in on this as well. It seems to me that that's something that I hear echoes of from descriptions of creativity, where often creative writers speak as if there is some sort of dissolution of the boundaries of the self in the moment of creation and so on. And obviously with psychedelics, which I don't know much about, but I understand that that's a theme there too. And Dr. LeDoux, I'm reminded of the fact that you've been seen wearing a T-shirt that said "No self, no fear." I'm wondering what happens to the self in mind wandering, and whether that too is a liminal area where, as Dr. Brand's talk conceived, there can be a space for essentially intersubjective communication, for picking up information from others. So this is just some ideas out there, but if you can just go around and sort of freely fill in some of the blanks, and then I'll turn it over to Pamela for a couple of questions from the audience, if we have time.
I think Kalina should respond to this first, because she knows much more about it than I do.
Were you referring to the content point, significance of content? I love both of these points, Valerio, both the content and the intersubjectivity, and how it plays into cognition in much more important ways than we dare admit as scientists often. But what occurred to me in terms of content is one of the slides that I skipped through pretty quickly in my presentation, but I was telling you briefly about the default variability hypothesis that we put forth based on the mechanics of hippocampus coding and generation of content. And it occurs to me that what happens during free association is very unique in terms of that drift that we experience, because every next thought is cued by the previous one in almost a mysterious way. So the thought contents of my current mental state are going to, in some way, unpredictably and interestingly, cue the next one, but the cue will be a very small part, almost a non-salient part of the current mental content. And so sometimes if I'm not very attentive as to how that cueing happens, and sometimes I'm just unable to detect that connection, it's so subtle, it'll appear as though it's random. So a lot of people report that. But, and I think maybe that's where analytic psychotherapy would come in. If you're really attentive, tuned in, and open-minded as to what that small and sometimes imperceptible cues from the present mental state may be that connect to the next one, then there's an interesting story there that might tell us a lot about our unconscious narratives, which are, I believe, ultimately inaccessible to us in their evolutions and how they unfold. But what we do access is the outcomes. So it's almost like a detective story that we have to do in our own minds, and the therapist has to do together with a patient, because we just are presented with the outcomes of these unconscious narratives, as Joe described. But there's a whole story there that is just never presented to us consciously. But to some extent, at which to some extent at least, we can reconstruct that story, and that story can teach us a lot about our emotions that also occurred on an unconscious level, or desires or fears, by that detective story reconstruction. And so I think the mode that allows that is freely associative, because it requires the lowering of executive control over thought, or cognitive control over thought. That corresponds to the frontoparietal control network, which, by the way, psychedelics knock out, and alcohol as well. But what happens is, if we're employing the executive network or the frontoparietal control network, then we're constraining the connection between consecutive mental states to be a logical and sensible one. And a sensible one basically means the salient parts of the current mental state are going to trigger the next mental state. So we experience this logically connected stream of thought that's not particularly interesting, actually, if you think about it, or exciting, or creative for that matter. So what I think is unique about this free associative state and how it can be understood from neuroscience is that you're relaxing at least the frontoparietal control network in order to allow much more hippocampal cueing in kind of unpredictable and in almost fragmented but interesting ways that give us information and clues about this unconscious narrative and reality that we don't have access to, what's going on under the hood. And then what psychedelics do on top of that, and they've been now, they're being researched as an adjunct to some therapies in order to further deepen that freeing of the mind. Because what they end up disconnecting then is the default network, in addition to the frontoparietal control network, so that not only are my deliberate constraints or my force of will being subside, but also this self-narrative that very much controls us all the time, but does not occur intentionally, control us as well. So the self-narrative are things I'm always looking for, what's related to me, and what's salient to me, and what might be good or bad for me. And this doesn't actually happen intentionally. In fact, it's hard to stop it. And so, but that is another thing that actually cues heavy-handedly the next mental state relative to the current mental state. And in fact, it can lead to pathology. So then I think where therapy comes in, psychedelics comes in, and everything that tries to treat pathology tries to not just dismantle the conscious control over thought, but the automatic control, the unconscious control over thought, which can happen by various habits, or sometimes it can happen by a social interactive context. So that's where our interactivity and social dynamics come in, because with some therapists, I'm going to have no insights about my unconscious narrative. And with others that I click with, I will. And so I think that click has to do with whether that therapist is capable of also reducing the automatic constraints on my own thought that are plaguing me or not. So those were my thoughts as I was hearing you mention that first thought. So sorry if I went into too much rambling around it.
That was very beautiful, very great description, Kalina, of, I think, summarized a lot of stuff. Yeah, I really enjoyed learning more about your work and Larry's work. And I'm very happy that Valerio got me to participate and kind of just have some comments on all of this. But I have one sort of anecdotal experience about, the intersubjectivity thing. And it was triggered by Valerio saying, creativity. So like if you have two people in a band, or let's 5 or 6 people in a band, and you know when that has happened, that you've clicked in some kind of unconscious way and it's just feeling great. But the second you think about it, you lose it. You know, the trick is to remain in that lower level of the stream of consciousness where you're feeling it, but not, you know, top downing it. So
Yeah, absolutely. Larry, feel free to jump in. I certainly have some thoughts myself from my own personal experience of playing music with other people. I think it's a really unique experience that's very much related to creativity and intersubjectivity, and also to these automatic constraints that we were discussing as well.
Larry, I think you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear.
I think about it more from the dyad rather than the larger group, and you know, in intersubjectivity, the analyst and the patient, or two people going out for a cup of coffee together, begin to kind of connect with each other by not only talking about their history, but the emotions that begin to get generated as a result of their growing intimacy by sharing their experiences in the past. And for me, as I think about what's important to me as a psychoanalyst in 2021, is the complete emphasis on the importance of emotional experience, period. And when I say that, I mean how there are processes in the unconscious that give meaning to experiences that are, and I don't know the right terminology for the for Dr. LeDoux's and Kalina's points of view, but there are unconscious processes, the goal of which is to take material that is just sensory oriented and to gradually transform it into something that is more of a meaningful emotional experience. You see this, for example, in the simplest ways between a mother and an infant, that the infant cries, and that triggers something, hopefully, in the mother, who responds to the infant, and the infant accordingly kind of takes in, for lack of a better word, that experience, and it becomes part of that infant's sense of safety. And maybe going back to what Dr. LeDoux was talking about in terms of the nature of the fears that can occur. So again, I just want to underscore the importance of emotional experience and how that is managed between two people. And in analysis, as you heard in the paper that I gave, the short paper, how the patient and I were interacting in very, very subtle ways together until we both came up with this notion of taking the plunge. And that was some anxiety that at first was unknown to us, or put another way, untransformed from a sensory experience to a more cognitive experience. But gradually over a period of time, that became a more higher function, or a discussion, or a shared experience on a higher level, away from the sensory roots of it all.
Mm-hmm. Do we have a 2 minutes time for me to just add something to just a response to Larry, or should we wrap up at this point, 2:30?
I think we have 2 minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
So
I just wanted to say something that struck me as a really interesting parallel between Larry, your description of the therapeutic dynamic that you presented in your paper, and Joe, your description of what musicians go through when they talk to each other, because it seems to be that the point of analogy here is that moment of reaching the insight about the fear and where the fear lies in that downward slope descent. And that point where two musicians talk to each other through music and then reach a point where they've discovered something new. It's very similar. And I think as a neuroscientist, I immediately try to figure out what is happening in their brains. And one of the image I have is of this, that's where emotion comes in as well. There's there's an echoing that happens both between the therapist and the client, as you described it, Larry, and also between two musicians that play together or 4 or 5 musicians that play together. And when they improvise, whether the therapist and the patient or the musicians, someone may echo something that they randomly say or play on the instrument. And that echoing is actually a positive reinforcement for that thing. It serves as the other person liked it or in some way found it significant. And in that, there's a real power that it influences our own next thought or next experience in ways that we couldn't go in that direction without another person echoing that particular part. So it's almost like a way of getting out of our mental ruts, whether those are musical mental ruts or thinking mental ruts, because someone else emphasized something and positively reinforced it for us socially by imitating it or repeating it. And I think it's a beautiful process in just self-discovery that we couldn't find without that positive echoing that people can do for us.
Thank you so much. This has been so fascinating. I am going to take another 2 minutes. You'll have to be very brief in answering this. And this is a question from Alfredo Spagna from Colombia. He says, his question is twofold. So from a theoretical standpoint, what do you think is the role of mental imagery, whether visual, auditory, etc., in mind wandering? So let me give you the second half because it gives it some context. From a neuroscientific point of view, while early theories in the field posed a substantial overlap in neural substrates of perception and imagery, a growing body of evidence points towards the involvement of a hippocampal fusiform network, mostly left lateralized in imagery. Is there evidence of such brain activation in the literature on mind wandering? So I think maybe, Kalina, you're the...
Yes, there is some evidence, and I can very quickly summarize it. And I'll say that we published this in a chapter, but not the evidence is very hard to get because so the evidence is that it's both. So there's commonalities in the brain that are involved in mental imagery. The hippocampal and parahippocampal involvement, they're common across all modalities of imagery because the medial temporal lobe is involved in spontaneous constructions, in fact, in mental simulations, as neuroscientists now believe and understand to be. But then there's also unique features of activations and recruitment depending on the modality of mental imagery. So on top of the common activations in medial temporal lobe, which effectively says that something was being generated and constructed, you would also have more visual cortex if there's more visual modality, or you would have more auditory if there's narrative, or you would have limbic circuits activated if there's a strong emotional quality to the imagery to it. So we've seen that, but it's hard to do that research because it requires people that are really trained in introspective observation to report on these things. So we've done that with highly trained meditators who can discriminate subtleties between these. And for most people, there isn't that good introspective access.
Joseph, do you want to say anything about that?
No, it's not really my field, so I think she's probably covered it better than I did.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm afraid, there are such great questions in the Q&A, which I really wish that we could ask all of them. I wish we had another hour. This has just been a fascinating session and Q&A. So thank you all, all our wonderful speakers today for joining us. Thank you to the audience for your really thoughtful questions. I wish we could have gotten to all of them. just make sure that you visit our website to register or sign up for more event updates. For any of you PSSN or CSS affiliates in the room, there will be another smaller discussion with the speakers, live discussions. So you should have received the link by now from Joseph. If you haven't, Joseph is going to stay here for a few minutes, so you can just ask him directly. So with that, I just need to close out for now and say, please join us at our next event. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.